Good afternoon, all, and thank you again for joining the State Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Summit. As we wrap up our break, I wanted to make just a couple of announcements before turning to our next panel. And so I know that there has been a lot of questions and comments coming through the chat. That is welcome. It's great to see so much interest and engagement. As you know, our panels are short on time and rich in conversation, and so we have not been able to get to many of the questions. However, we are assembling those and gathering the questions or the comments that you do send in, and we'll be able to share with our panelists afterwards, as well as some of our partners at DOE and TOT, so that they can take a look and get back to folks. And so feel free to continue to send in those questions through the Q&A, and feel free to use the chat to share information. And so with that, I would like to begin our next panel and invite our panelists to turn on their cameras. We will be exploring equity considerations for widespread EV infrastructure build out. And I'd like to turn it over to Kelley Smith-Burk with the Florida Office of Energy, also the NASEO board chair, to get us started. Kelley.
Thank you, Cassie, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Cassie said, we have a short time and this panel is going to have a lot of information for you, but we hope that this panel will be the start of a conversation that you're having within your states and within your communities, and that you will use these panelists as resources once we're done. But as Cassie said, we're going to talk about equity considerations for the build out of EV infrastructure. And this is so important because as we are looking at investing in that type of infrastructure, we need to make sure that all of our communities have access to clean energy transportation, not just the wealthy or not just those that can afford it, but that we are really gearing our programs and policies toward those communities that need it most. And that also means not just, putting what we think they need in infrastructure in there, but meeting them where they are at and making sure that what we are investing in is actually something that will be useful to them and will be helpful to them within their communities. So that's what we're going to talk about today, because I think a lot of states are really starting to look at equity issues, not just in the utility sector, but also looking at it in the transportation sector. So this conversation today, I think, will be very important as we're starting these processes of investing in this infrastructure. So we have three great panelists that are with us today. First, we have Jeff Allen, who's the Executive Director of Fourth Mobility. Then we have Fabiola Liao. Did I say that correctly, Fabi?
Lau.
Thank you. My apologies.
That's okay.
She's the senior equity policy manager for the Center for Sustainable Energy. And then we have Roman Partida Lopez. Did I say that correctly? Awesome. Who's the Environmental Equity Legal Counsel for Redlining Institute. And since we have a little limited amount of time, we're just going to jump right into our conversation. So my first question today will be for Roman. And it is, today's event is about exploring ways to strategically, efficiently, and equitably invest in EV charging stations to support broader transportation electrification and climate goals. Many of us have backgrounds in energy and transportation policy and program development, but are new to the equity discussion. So I'm going to ask you, when you use the word equity, what do you mean, and what should maybe be a baseline that all of us are looking at?
Yeah, thank you, Kelley, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. As Kelley mentioned, I'm Roman Partida Lopez with the Redlining Institute. We're a racial and economic equity advocacy organization working to redress the impacts of redlining on low-income communities of color. For us, when we think about equity, I think what comes to mind and what is rooted in and kind of what it's the root and what our basis is thinking about the racial inequities and policies that have been in place that have led to disinvestments in our low-income communities of color. I mentioned redlining, and for those that are unfamiliar with the practice of redlining, redlining was one of many racist policies that was instituted in systemic practice of government working with financial institutions to draw literal red lines around communities of color and deny them loans and other financial services that have led to, as I mentioned, a lot of inequities and disinvestments in our communities. If you can just do a quick Google of redlining and then the city or state where you operate, you'll probably find one and most likely will overlap with the existing low-income communities that exist now within your state. For redlining, I think as we think about equity, again, this racial and social equity is what is at the core. we approach our work thinking through direct benefits and investments for historically disinvested communities. We really, as we approach our work and through this racial and social equity lens, it allows us to really reflect on past racial inequities in our communities and what they've endured, and offers a lens to think through about all the possible outcomes and consequences that policies will have on diverse communities, and help design policies that reduce disparities and address the needs for all. As you can see from this image, equity is not equality. Equity means providing more resources and right-sizing the solution to best meet the needs of the community. We all know that all communities are not the same, so it's important that we take that approach when thinking about developing an equitable policy program or investment. We think about equity as well. I think for Greenlining and what we share out is we want to make sure that we're increasing access to power to those frontline and vulnerable communities, that we're redistributing and providing additional resources and eliminating barriers to opportunities in order to empower marginalized groups such as low-income communities of color to thrive and reach their full potential, right? So we encourage agencies, as you all start this work or continue this work, to do that work internally, but also work with local community partners to best understand the historical context of the communities, as well as determine what a proper equity definition might be, and ensure that that equity definition includes standards that will guide the work, develop goals, and then develop equity outcomes to ensure that you're delivering equity in a way that is represented by the community. Thank you.
Ramon. Fabi, I'm going to turn to you for our next question. And so the Center for Sustainable Energy has been working with communities in California and across the country on rolling out equitable transportation programs. Can you share some examples with us of ways to tailor equity considerations to community needs?
Yes, thank you. So once again, I'm Fabiola, Senior Equity Policy Manager with the Center for Sustainable Energy. For those of you who are not familiar with CSC, we're a national nonprofit, and our program administrators issue quite a few AEB programs in quite a few states, and also technical advisors. So, well, I'll just kind of expand upon what Roman was talking about with equity definitions. For example, that is like the one place, a very foundational place where whatever program that you want to do, you want to make sure that where you're finding equity with community input so that it addresses their needs and their solutions. So for example, here I'm based in San Diego. So in the city of San Diego, they have the climate action plan, and they put together an equity stakeholder working group that actually Roman and I are both part of, to create a climate equity index that will help them implement a climate action plan. And one of the elements of the action, the CAP, includes like EVs and EVI. But they wanted to really make sure that it met the needs of like low-income communities and communities of color here in the region. And the first thing they do was come up with a climate equity definition. And they just kind of took over what was out there from different sources, from other cities' plans. But at the end of the day, it was really tailored, and it really reflected the feedback and what the community and community-based organizations and community leaders wanted, to make sure here is like what we want to. Included, part of the definition includes addressing and recognizing the historical inequities that have happened. So that's a very key part. And just to elaborate, so like that was the first step, coming up with the climate equity definition. And then there was another aspect for that, to actually come up with the climate equity index, which is like a mapping tool to kind of help identify those communities in the city of San Diego that have been historically underinvested and haven't had access to resources of programs. And once again, the community provided the feedback on which indicators will go into the methodology to come up with the ranking system to actually help identify those communities. And we have very robust conversations about what those indicators were, because they needed to reflect what folks wanted in different parts of the city that had different needs. So that was a very tailored approach. And then the neighboring city for the city of San Diego, the city of Chula Vista, they said, hey, the city of San Diego did such a great job. We want to do our own climate equity index. We also want to come up with our own climate equity definition. And what happened was that they borrowed pretty much the same definition from the city of San Diego, but once again, it's a different city. That city has very different communities. They have very different needs and solutions. And they expanded upon the definition even further to really make sure that access to decision making was a component of the definition, because we felt that it was really important for folks here in Chula Vista to do that. So as you can tell, it was like, although it was a similar effort, the definitions were slightly different because they were very customized and very tailored, reflective community needs. And the same thing happened. The city of Chula Vista, slightly different climate equity definition. And also in its climate equity index, the indicators also were different. There were some of the same ones as the city of San Diego, but they also included other indicators that were very important to the community to demonstrate, hey, these are the communities and the neighborhoods that actually have, they're lower in the socioeconomic status, included information such as like preschool enrollment, for example, as an indicator of health and access. So that's something that wasn't in the city of San Diego. So this is to tell you that the best way to go about this job at a foundational level is to go through this process of engaging communities, community-based organizations, community leaders, nonprofits, and other stakeholders. And you will see that there will be different needs, different solutions, and you have to address those. And that's like the foundational, beginning of any effort. Definitions is so key for folks.
Thank you, Fabi. And I think that that's so true and so important. And I think it's a good distinction too, that the definitions may not all be the same. We might have a similar baseline, but we need to be adaptable based upon what we're seeing those communities need. So that's a great point. So Jeff, I'm going to turn to you, and I think we'll build on this just a little bit, but states and communities have long offered energy and transportation programs. Many may need to retool existing programs or offer new ones to meet those needs of the communities in their jurisdictions. Is there a framework that states and cities may follow when envisioning, designing, or implementing equitable EV programs?
Yeah, great question. I think there's several different tools that are helpful to sort of operationalize equity, and there's lots of tools and resources on all three of our websites. Fourth, like the other two panelists, we're a nonprofit, nationwide, mission-driven organization, so we give it all away for free. So I encourage you to check that out. I'd give a special shout out to the framework that Redlining has developed. And the way I oversimplify it is you really want to start with looking at the different aspects of equity. So I think many folks think about air pollution. Okay, well, are we benefiting air quality for folks who are on the front lines for air pollution because of redlining and other things? But it's also important to look at mobility benefits. Michael Berube mentioned before, transportation is the second highest household expense. Another resource I stole from Redlining was a study that pointed out that the single greatest predictor of getting out of poverty for a family is commute time. And in most of our communities, the quickest commute is in a car, unfortunately. So access to effective transportation, reliable transportation, the mobility benefits is a second aspect. And then the third is the economic aspect of equity. Are there job opportunities? Are the economic benefits of electrification flowing to historically underserved communities? And then the fourth kind of cuts across is process equity, right? Who's at the table? Who's part of the conversation? Who's making decisions? Who's accountable to whom in a community? So I think that's one really useful framework. I think you've heard us all say, or you would hear us all say, that we would start with community engagement, some form of a needs assessment. I think the other framework that we found really helpful in our work at Fourth is the targeted universalism approach. In other words, starting with the folks, and again, grossly oversimplifying, center the folks who have the most barriers, design your program around them, and you will have a better program. And just to give a really specific example in the charging space, I think we all know that if you say, we're going to have a program that promotes equality, and anyone who owns a home and wants to put a charger in the garage, we're going to pay for that as a state or as an electric utility. That might be equality, but it's definitely not equity, because due to redlining and other policies, communities of color have not been able to access home ownership. They don't have the assets. And so home ownership skews very white nationwide. So then you look at, okay, so how do we design a program to provide charging in apartment buildings? But again, if you just say, we're going to provide charging in apartment buildings, any apartment building that wants one, give us a call and we'll come install it. Those hand raisers, those early adopters are not going to, they're going to be the $1 million condos, right? They're not where somebody bought a car and wants a place to plug it in. So if you really want to center equity and design a program that will make it as easy and as cheap to charge in an apartment building as it is to charge in a private home, then you need to go to low and moderate income apartment buildings and figure out, how do we design a program that makes it easy for them to provide charging? Last thing I'd say as far as a tool or a framework, there's a good example I think a lot of the folks on the call will be interested in from the state of Oregon. We did some of this work under contract to ODOT, so not to toot our own horn, but we had a bunch of other partners. And the state of Oregon recently developed a transportation electrification infrastructure needs analysis, or TINA, that involved a fair amount of stakeholder engagement and outreach and focus groups. So I would point states to that as another really specific example.
Great. So I want to just center on a particular conversation about community engagement. I think a lot of us as state and government officials, we're used to having public meetings, workshops, as we're looking at designing programs and policies. But I think that one of the things that we've all been talking about is how important it is to have that community engagement, to meet people where they are, especially as we're looking at making this investment. So as we're looking at that, what should states and cities and governments be engaging with, and who should they be engaging with at the community and level to make sure that we're accurately hearing, responding to local needs? And then a second part of that is, what other principles should states follow for meaningful community engagement? And I'm going to open that up to all of you, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, and I could kick us off here because I think I just want to build on something that Jeff shared that I think is really important. And, taking that baseline, right, through a needs assessment. So the state of California a couple of years ago did several barrier studies, right, and met directly with community-based organizations in their community to talk about the various transportation barriers that they face, right? Both from, ranging from public to EVs, right? And really determining what those needs are, and then what the priorities are, and then have that be input that's provided in developing state programs. And those reports and those various reports have been referenced a lot here in the state as state agencies continue to build out new projects. So having that needs assessment, I think, is important. But as we think about who we're engaging, is those community-based organizations in your communities, in those communities, right, that represent low-income communities of color. It's the community members themselves and having a conversation with them. When we think about the utilities, is thinking through ratepayer advocacy groups as well, right? Because I think there's an important angle that they bring to the discussion that's important and that must be highlighted as we're having these discussions. And through those efforts, really build out what those potential projects might look like and where to invest and how to invest, right? And just thinking about then how do we prioritize investments in where we see those biggest barriers and challenges, right? Jeff mentioned the need for in multi-unit dwellings or affordable housing, but that's probably where you're going to face the biggest barriers in deploying EV infrastructure, being able to deploy more resources and apply that equity lens to ensure that that's a component that where you're focusing limited funds to make sure that you're addressing the needs of the needs of those that face the biggest barriers.
And I guess I'll go next because I think we're piggybacking on each other, which is great. So just like, Roman mentioned, it's like, there's those various studies and just going to do the baseline. Then you can actually do, if you're at that program level, and at least here in the state of California, there have been a new equity transportation pilot programs that are actually providing very specific grants to help to fund those community needs assessments. They're planning grants. So then you have the implementation grants to actually those folks that actually already have an idea what kind of projects they want to have, almost shovel ready. But acknowledging that there's this gap of awareness and and just capacity to even to even, well, first be aware of these programs, but to also apply to these programs. So at least in the state of California, it is being acknowledged that, hey, we actually need to be funding folks to actually do that community needs assessment from the get-go, because they're not even ready at the point, because they have to figure out what kind of projects they want. They need to figure out, hey, we want to have a conversation with the community. Where do we want chargers? Like, where do we want the charging stations to be that actually makes sense for our community? Those assessments will help identify that. But the main thing that I also want to point out is when you're working with community-based organizations, what is very key for them, is to include them in the whole process of planning. So from the design to the implementation to the evaluation. So for example, if you want to think about doing a program, you kind of go to a community-based organization. They're trusted messengers in the community. They're well respected. And they can give you that historical context of like what has been done in this neighborhood before, what have state agencies, what has the local government attempted to do in our community, and has it worked? So you kind of have to get that information first from them to start building that trust, because you might find that more often than not that bridges have been burned in the past, which we communities call them local communities, and there's a lot of mistrust of government agencies. So you kind of have to just have that initial conversation of like, and just listen to what they have to say. And once you have that trust, then when it's time to kind of, okay, now we're thinking of this project, you need to compensate community-based organizations and community leaders for their expertise. You need to treat them as consultants, just like you will pay a private firm and you pay them like $125 an hour or more. You need to do that for for these leaders, for community-based organizations, because they have the lived in experience and expertise. Nobody knows their communities and their needs and the solutions better than they do. And that's just one way, whether you compensate them, hey, let's do a grant program where you can start helping us spread the word through marketing, education, and outreach efforts, or you put an advisory council together, you also compensate them for their time there. In whatever way it is that you're getting their feedback, the key thing is to compensate them, because, they're already stretched thin. Most of the organizations are very small. They have limited fundings, they're stretched thin. And in order for them to meaningfully participate, they're going to have to be compensated.
Jeff, was there anything you wanted to add on this topic, or?
That was pretty darn thorough. I would just underline, because that was one of the failings, I have to say, of our program in Oregon. The needs assessment was they were not able to figure out, I understand this is tough for state agencies to figure out, how do we compensate those community members, those community-based organizations? But it's just to underline, if I could underline anything, that's it. So you cannot expect these folks to do this work for you for free.
Thank you. So I think we might have time for one more question. I know this time is like flown by. We could spend days on this topic, but my final question to you all is, we're talking about EV infrastructure planning, but EV infrastructure is meaningless if people don't have access to vehicles or clean transportation options. Beyond infrastructure, what complementary transportation programs should states be considering to enhance access within disadvantaged and underserved communities? And I'll open that up to all of you to respond.
Gosh, I'd love to jump on this one first, because this is a pet of mine, and I'm so glad you asked it, because again, charging doesn't provide mobility. It provides access at some level, but what we really care about is mobility and serving those community needs. So I think, again, this is an example of where designing by centering equity will get you a better program. So if you're putting charging, for example, and I know a lot of the discussion today is focused on corridor charging, but as a couple of folks have said, there's a lot of flexibility in what you do with corridor charging, right? It could be on the interstate in the middle of nowhere and only serve people who are driving long distances and passing through communities. Or it can be located closer to a city center near some apartment buildings where folks who live there and can't charge in the apartment building now have access to charging. And if you can build on that even more and engage with community and think about how do you use that charging and sort of layer wraparound programming around it that will meet community needs. Not only are you serving the community needs and increasing mobility, but you're increasing utilization of that charger. And just a couple of quick examples. We have a project in St. Louis where we're working with a non-government organization that does non-emergency medical transport for seniors. to get them into electric vehicles that they can use for their operations and for transporting seniors that, again, will support that infrastructure. We have another program where we're placing electric vehicles near fast chargers that can be rented by community members and can also be basically utilities can hand out access codes and people can then use their phone to unlock the car for an hour or two to do a test drive. So you can have self-service test drives during a time of COVID. You can serve community needs and you're guaranteeing there's some vehicles using that charger. Or there's just really basic things like making sure you're putting the chargers where gig drivers can access and use them, where there's services nearby that they could use. So lots of creative solutions if you're asking the right questions.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, I think, the need for complementary programs is necessary in order to see the deployment of electric vehicles in low-income communities of color. As Jeff mentioned, charging by itself is not enough, right? We need to have the vehicle incentive programs as well to support that transition. I saw a question in the chat about how do we make that possible given all the existing challenges and gas prices going up. And again, just with limited incentive dollars that are out there, it's important that the utility is working with the agency that is in charge of potentially providing incentives, or if it's the utility themselves, vehicle incentives, of developing an incentive program that is embedding equity from the beginning, right? Ensuring that there are increased incentives for new vehicle purchases as well as used vehicle purchases, right? If there is a lack of used vehicles in the state that you might be, really developing a new vehicle incentive program that maximizes its incentives at lower income households. Here in California, years ago we had the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, and that was it. There was some equity embedded into the program, but it wasn't enough. We needed more. So there was policy passed to create a Clean Cars for All program that allowed low income households to transition and get into newer vehicles with a much higher with a much higher incentive amount that both provided them the opportunity to get a new vehicle, but a used vehicle as well, right? And I think it's really thinking about what those complementary programs look like at the beginning and embedding equity early on so that, you're not trying to address that later on and are just creating additional barriers by trying to do that down the line. And the last thing I'll note is, I think, to what Jeff was also sharing is that we have to think about, beyond just vehicle ownership, right? What are some of the other mobility options that are out there that can help support low-income households that might not have access to vehicles, or, whether that be a car sharing model, or it could be something else that operates within the household that they're in, within the residence that they live. And then thinking about creative ways, right? And allowing the community to determine what those mobility options should be, right? And have that be the basis for whatever incentive program gets developed.
Fabi, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, they have summarized and done a great job.
Okay, great. Well, we've pretty much come up to the end of our time. I want to thank Jeff, Roman, and Fabi for being with us today. I think that you have given us a lot of information to absorb, and I would encourage everyone to check the chat because I know Cassie's been dropping some links in there, as well as Fabi and Jeff and some other folks that you can use as resources. I would also encourage you to reach out to our panelists if you have questions, if you want to have more in-depth conversations, if you really want to use their expertise in order to look at how you're doing your program design. These are some great folks for you to use as a resource, and I know that they are willing to have that conversation with all of us. This is a subject area that I think we all need to be considering as we're moving forward, and just having these conversations and getting more information, I think, is beneficial to all of us states as we start on this path. So again, thank you to our panelists today. I really appreciate you all, and I'm going to turn it back over